In the flickering candlelight of a Prussian estate, General Heinz Guderian stared at maps that told a story no one in Berlin wanted to hear. It was December 1941, and while Hitler's propaganda machine still trumpeted inevitable victory, Guderian's fingers traced the impossible mathematics of the Eastern Front. His panzer spearheads, once the swift sort of blitzkrieg, now crawled through Russian mud like wounded animals. The numbers were stark, undeniable. For every mile gained, Germany bled resources it could never replace. For every Soviet division destroyed, 2 more materialized from the vastness beyond the Urals. This was not the lightning war they had perfected in Poland and France. This was something far more sinister, a war of attrition that would devour everything they held dear. But Guderian was not alone in his growing dread. Across the frozen steppes of Russia, in command bunkers from Leningrad to Stalingrad, other German generals were reaching the same terrifying conclusion. They had walked into a trap of their own making, lured by early victories into a contest they could not win. The realization didn't come as a thunderclap of understanding. Instead, it crept through the officer corps like poison, spreading from whispered conversations in mess halls to coded warnings in personal letters home. These were not defeatists or cowards speaking. These were the architects of Germany's greatest military triumphs, the disciples of Clausewitz and Moltke, trained to read the grammar of war with ruthless precision. And what they read in those winter months of 1941 was Germany's doom. The irony was exquisite and terrible. Hitler's generals had spent years rebuilding the Wehrmacht from the ashes of Versailles, crafting a military machine they believed invincible. They had proven their theories in the crucible of combat, watching enemy armies collapse before their innovative tactics. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British had fled across the Channel. The Balkans had crumbled like ancient parchment. Victory had become a drug, and they were all addicts intoxicated by their own success. But intoxication clouds judgment, and judgment is everything in war. By the time the snow began to fall on Army Group Center, that intoxication was wearing off, replaced by a cold sobriety that chilled more than any Russian winter. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its mobility and concentration of force, had become its fatal weakness in the endless expanse of the Soviet Union. Supply lines stretched like gossamer threads across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. Fuel depots ran empty while panzer divisions sat idle. Infantry marched in summer uniforms through sub-zero temperatures. The logistics that had seemed so manageable in staff college exercises now revealed themselves as impossibly complex equations with no solutions. And in that winter of 1941, as German soldiers froze in positions they could neither hold nor abandon, the most perceptive of Hitler's generals began to understand a truth that would haunt them until the war's bitter end. They had not conquered the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had conquered them, not through superior tactics or equipment, but through something far more fundamental, the simple, inexorable mathematics of space, time, and resources. The war was lost before the first shot of Barbarossa was fired. They just didn't know it yet. In the spring of 1942, as thaw turned mud into a quagmire that swallowed tanks and men alike, another realization took root in the minds of Germany's senior leadership. The allure of grand offensives, the promise of rapid, decisive breakthroughs, had blinded them to the invisible war being fought against supply, distance, and time. Now, under threat from partisan attacks on railway lines and constant Soviet counterattacks, the Wehrmacht's vaunted mobility was a hollow boast. Fuel convoys lurched forward under fire, only to be stalled by impassable roads and collapsing bridges. Meanwhile, factories back in the Reich strained under Allied bombing campaigns that targeted oil refineries, shipyards, and transportation hubs. Every bomb dropped on German soil was another nail in the coffin of Blitzkrieg. General Erich von Manstein, architect of the spectacular victories in France and Crimea, penned a private memo that read like a requiem for the Army's former glory. He argued that without secure supply lines and adequate reserves, no amount of tactical brilliance could turn the tide. His words circulated among the upper echelons, not as a challenge to Hitler's authority, but as a plea for pragmatic retreat to more defensible lines. They called it elastic defense, a strategy born of desperation rather than choice. Yet even this modest proposal clashed with the Führer's obsession with offense. Hitler's orders were absolute. No withdrawals, no compromises. Every position must be held, every town retaken, every Soviet advance repelled. By mid-1942, Operations Blau and Edelweiss split Army Group South into two prongs. One aimed at the oil fields of the Caucasus, the other at the factories and symbolic prize of Stalingrad. In staff rooms from Berlin to Rostov, experts warned of the folly in dividing forces across vast expanses. They pointed to the lessons of Barbarossa, where concentrated force had once achieved dramatic results. Now, that same concentration was fractured, leaving each spearhead vulnerable. Yet Hitler dismissed these misgivings, blaming pessimists for undermining morale. When the first harsh winds of autumn swept across the Russian plains, the German push on Stalingrad stalled in the rubble-choked streets. Urban combat devoured troops, ammunition, and willpower. The ambient noise, shellfire, shattering masonry, screams, drowned out the High Command's propaganda machine. In the choke point of the Volga, Soviet reinforcements poured across pontoon bridges. The encirclement of the Sixth Army in November was less a shock than the inevitable consequence of long-ignored warnings. Those who had cautioned against overextension looked on with grim validation, their worst fears realized in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. Yet, even in the face of institutional collapse, the officer corps clung to a fragile form of duty. Orders continued to flow, drafted by generals who already knew they were signing death warrants. Letters home described bitter cold, scarce food, and a sense of abandonment that cut deeper than any wound. Private conversations reveal that many commanders no longer spoke of victory but of survival, of keeping their men alive long enough to see Germany again, or at least to die honorably. To admit defeat outright remained unthinkable. To speak it aloud was treason. The winter of 1942-43 marked a turning point not only in military fortunes but in the collective mindset. Once they believed themselves the masters of war, now they were its prisoners, trapped by decisions made in warmer months and softer chairs far from the front lines. The Soviet counteroffensive shattered Hoffman's Seventh Army and peeled back the gains in the Caucasus. The Black Sea Fleet evaded Axis control, and oil supplies dwindled. Germany's war machine coughed and sputtered. In that moment, the unspoken consensus solidified. Victory was no longer attainable. It was an aspiration of the faithless. What remained was management of decline, minimizing losses and preserving what could be preserved. For some, this meant plotting the unthinkable, discussions of removing the man who refused to acknowledge the obvious. But such schemes carried mortal danger. The Gestapo was ever vigilant. Better to endure the madness than to risk execution for high treason. The year 1943 opened with a fragile optimism among some officers. A belief that a single, spectacular victory at Kursk might reverse Germany's fortunes. They called it Operation Citadel, a nod to strength and invincibility. Yet beneath the veneer of confidence, skepticism ran deep. Intelligence reports indicated Soviet defenses bristling with anti-tank guns, minefields, and entrenched riflemen. Reconnaissance flights revealed concentrations of T-34s and fresh infantry units. In quiet staff briefings, commanders warned that the element of surprise was gone. The Red Army had learned from Barbarossa and Winter's nightmare. They anticipated the attack. But Hitler, buoyed by wishful thinking and desperate for a win, overruled doubts. He declared Kursk the Panzer Army's moment of redemption. On July 5th, the offensive began. Panzer divisions thundered across mine-scarred fields, momentarily punching through Soviet lines. For a fleeting moment, the blitzkrieg magic seemed rekindled. But every breakthrough met another prepared position, every armored wedge stalled by concealed obstacles. Supply columns again faltered, choked by destroyed bridges and relentless partisan ambushes. The black smoke of burning vehicles hung like a shroud, and the staccato rhythm of artillery became an oppressive metronome. In the bowels of command posts, generals watched helplessly as their armored spearheads lost momentum. Casualty reports climbed. Fuel stocks dwindled. Radio contact with frontline units crackled with despair. 2 weeks later, the offensive ground to a halt. The Wehrmacht had achieved its deepest penetration into Soviet defenses, but at a cost far exceeding any potential gain. Stunned by the depth of enemy fortifications and the ferocity of Soviet counterattacks, commanders recognized Kursk as the death knell for Germany's offensive capacity. The Red Army launched its own counteroffensive on July 12, rolling westward in a tide of steel and infantry. German forces, caught off guard by their own failure to secure flanks and supply, retreated under fire. The summer of 1943, meant to be the turning point for Germany, became the apex of Soviet military prowess on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, the Wehrmacht would fight purely a defensive war. At high command level, conversations shifted from victory to survival. Strategic sessions devolved into debates over how to delay the Soviet juggernaut, how to plug breaches with insufficient troops, and how to ration ammunition and fuel. It was a grim exercise in triage. Decisions became agony. Which front to reinforce, which ally to prop up, which territory to abandon. All the while, Allied air raids intensified, reducing German cities to rubble and crippling war production. U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, were hunted relentlessly by improved Allied convoys and sonar technology. No front mirrored the next. Every theater strained Germany's resources to breaking point. By autumn, any illusion of ultimate victory had vanished entirely. In meeting rooms where Hitler still clung to dreams of miracle weapons, generals spoke candidly of defeat. Some urged negotiations, hoping to preserve Germany from total destruction. Others entertained fantasies of an Anglo-Soviet split, a resultant pact with Britain against Stalin. But these notions were refuges for the desperate. The real consensus, unspoken but universally understood, was that Germany had gambled and lost. The Wehrmacht's glory days were over. What remained was a brutal struggle to salvage honor and prevent utter collapse. And so the stage was set for the final acts of a tragic drama. The generals, once the masters of blitzkrieg, were now its prisoners, bound by orders they knew led to ruin. Their inner surrender preceded the world's. They fought on, not for victory, but for duty, for men under their command, and for a memory of what once had been. The war they had helped unleash would end not with triumph, but with hollow echoes in ruined cities, and in the quiet confession of soldiers who realized they had lost long before the guns fell silent. In the final months of 1944 and early 1945, Germany's military command existed in a state of quiet despair. The Western Allies poured across the Rhine, while the Red Army pressed into East Prussia and Silesia. Fuel reserves were critical, ammunition stocks dwindled, and the Luftwaffe barely contested the skies. Yet Hitler issued orders more impossible by the day. Hold the Ardennes, split the Allied bridgeheads, counterattack from nowhere. Generals like Field Marshal Walter Model, famed for defensive mastery, resorted to what he called hedgehog defenses. Many strongpoints meant to delay rather than repel. His own diaries admit these were stopgaps born of desperation. Others disobeyed or falsified reports, refusing to carry out suicidal counterblows they knew would only bring more death. Within the bunker beneath Berlin on April 22, 1945, Hitler's breakdown was both private and public. Accounts differ, but most agree he finally confessed that defeat was inevitable and that suicide lay ahead. For the generals above, his confession brought no relief. They had recognized defeat years earlier, in the Russian winter of 1941, in the rubble of Stalingrad on the minefields of Kursk. Their hearts had surrendered long before their armies did. Now they watched Berlin fall, not with hope, but with a muted recognition that history's final judgment would not distinguish orders from obedience. When the guns fell silent in May, the surviving officers faced reckoning. Under Allied interrogation, they recast their roles as reluctant servants of a madman, as men who saw the disaster and tried to avert it. Some spoke truthfully of warnings ignored. Others recited platitudes of duty and loyalty. Memoirs flowed, each seeking to reshape the narrative of complicity and resistance. But whether they blamed Hitler, the SS, or fate itself, none could escape the fundamental fact. They had fought on, even when they knew the war was lost. They had rationalized obedience as honor, turning moral blindness into professional duty. The story of Hitler's generals is not simply one of strategic failure. It is a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of ideology, pride, and fear. It reminds us that even the most brilliant minds can surrender their judgment to loyalty when the stakes seem existential. It warns that war is not only a contest of weapons and tactics, but of wills, and that will can break long before the battlefield does. As we reflect on this history, one question endures. How many times have commanders, nations, or individuals continued fighting a battle they knew they could not win? And how many lives were sacrificed because admitting defeat was unthinkable? The generals of the Wehrmacht faced that same dilemma, choosing to prolong a futile war rather than confront the consequences of their own strategies. Today, their story stands as a stark reminder that true victory lies not in blind obedience, but in the courage to recognize when a battle or a moral imperative must end. In acknowledging defeat, leaders can save lives and preserve dignity. In refusing to do so, they condemn themselves and those they command to needless destruction. If you found this deep dive into history illuminating, please subscribe for more expert narratives, hit the like button to support thoughtful analysis, and share your thoughts in the comments below on moments in history when admitting defeat changed everything. Your engagement helps us explore these stories with the depth they deserve. Thank you for watching.